people in an authority position, they must not wear religious signs. And if we have to use the notwithstanding clause to apply what wants the majority of Quebecers, will do so.
Saskatchewan and Ontario will continue to be strong allies in the fight against a destructive, made in Ottawa carbon tax.
There's a change happening here in Canada. No matter if it's New Brunswick, or if it's Quebec, or if it's Ontario or Saskatchewan or Manitoba, Alberta, I'm sure in probably another year or so.
Quebec makes history and gives the Coalition Avenir Quebec a majority, and another Liberal government bites the dust. Now, the new premier-designate is already threatening to use the notwithstanding clause. Meanwhile, other provinces are busy creating alliances with one another. So is this the new norm? What kind of challenges does all of this pose for Ottawa? The At Issue gang is here to make sense of it all. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and Paul Wells is in Ottawa. Good to see everybody. Okay, let's start in Quebec. I know it's the same week as NAFTA, but it's also the same week as this. So we're going to start with this one because it is a substantive change. It's a historic change. Let's start with you, Chantal. What should Canadians make of what happened in Quebec this week?
That Quebecers throughout the main parties that had been fighting over the sovereignty issue at the same time as they threw out that issue and pushed it off the radar. The Liberals were not popular. People wanted change, and the PQ has lost a lot of ground over the past few years. So massive change. More than 80 out of 125 MNAs are members of parties that did not exist a decade ago.
And curiously, Andrew, happening at a time when Quebec is actually doing very well economically, when there is little to complain about on that front anyway.
Yeah, and we've seen this in some other elections, that including the last federal election, that it's not necessarily the economy stupid as the slogan had it, that people are more complicated than that. I mean, other things being equal, the economy does have enormous impact on every election, there's no doubt about it, but it's not the only thing. And if people are heartily sick of a government, they will let them know it in the most direct way.
And Paul, what was a lesson that you took from it?
I'm struck by how both in Ontario and in Quebec, the Liberal Party got the lowest share of the popular vote since Confederation. This is not a normal change election. It was a real thumping put on the Liberal Party, the provincial Liberal Party, in the two biggest provinces in the country. I'm also struck by the low turnout. Usually change elections, like when Stephen Harper became Prime Minister and when Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister federally, voter participation goes up. But this was the second lowest voter participation since the 1920s. This was Quebec giving up on the old parties much more than they were embracing this new one.
Okay, all of you touched on this in columns this week, and that's François Legault's threat, I guess, to invoke the notwithstanding clause in order to make sure that public servants, public employees can't wear religious symbols when they're doing their jobs, which is oddly something that was talked about in the last federal election too. I talked to Jean Chrétien, the former Prime Minister, who was one of the people that created the notwithstanding clause today, and he had this to say.
You have to declare that you're discriminating. How many normal person would say, I want to discriminate? This is what the notwithstanding clause is. Despite of the equality of this and that, I will do that.
So let me ask you all this question. How does a federal government handle a Quebec premier who is threatening this about this particular issue, which seems to be about identity politics, I think. Anyway, Chantal, go ahead.
Okay, well, the word threatens is the operative word.
Yeah.
You are talking about the premier-elect whose government has not been sworn in, who doesn't yet have a justice minister, who is not yet called the National Assembly to legislate, who is saying that if at the end of a judicial review of a law that doesn't exist yet, the law is found to be unconstitutional, he'll use the notwithstanding clause to override the charter. Let me just, before we get into what the federal government should do about this, run you through what that means as a timeline. It probably means 2 or 3 years between the presentation of a law, its adoption, the court's ruling on it, and if it is found unconstitutional, we get to that debate. For all I know, Justin Trudeau might not be Prime Minister by then. I think what happened this week is Mr. Legault seriously got his cart way ahead of the horses, and we will have that debate if it comes to that. But let's make sure that we're not having it 3 years ahead of time.
I'm all for that, Andrew.
Well, like Chantal, I'm not going to answer the question directly because I don't know at this point what the government's doing, and a lot of it will depend upon how things play out. What I do think we should be talking about, because I think this will be affecting the debate, is does the federal government have any role? Do we have a common set of rights in this country? Should we have a common set of rights in this country? Do people in other parts of the country have a vested interest, a moral interest in what happens in other parts of the country? Do we, or is it all just whatever happens within one province is their province, that province's business, and none of the rest of us should comment? If you think that we should have a common set of rights, and if you think we are implicated by what happens in any part of the country, then you're going to be more of the mind that says the federal government, if the charter is not going to be upheld by the courts, if they're going to be able to override a court ruling this, then I think somebody has to be prepared to represent the overriding national interest in establishing a common set of rights and establishing that we're not going to victimize vulnerable minorities in this country.
Paul, your thoughts on that?
Well, when Andrew goes wide, I like to go narrow. I don't disagree with anything he said, but I was struck by how Premier-elect Legault said that he will use the notwithstanding clause to do what a majority of Quebecers want. I fondly wish him all the best luck in finding out what a majority of Quebecers want on these issues. The PQ government and then the Liberal government did their best, and they face-planted bad because Quebecers at the margin changed their minds about what they want. It's not true that they monolithically fear or detest people wearing religious insignia as they go about their daily work. And typically a government that tries to move against that minuscule societal trend in Quebec discovers that those folks, those public servants who might be wearing Jewish or Muslim or Christian insignia suddenly have a lot of fans. And I think that's what Mr. Legault is going to find out long before Justin Trudeau has to step in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Rosie, if you look at what happened to the Parti québécois this week, it was reduced to to recounts, the lowest seat score, and about the same number of votes as what was a rump party until this election, Québec solidaire. The main reason for that is that voters that are 35 and younger did not want to support the PQ, and the main reason for that, when did they lose those voters, the largest cohort over the next few years, over the debate over the so-called secularism charter.
Yeah.
So the last party that played with this seriously was the Parti québécois, and look where it is today.
Okay, I try to squeeze in 2 more questions if I can. What does the federal government now do with a country that seems to be provincially governed by sort of right-leaning governments? We've talked about it a little bit before, and certainly, it might happen again in Alberta in the spring. So how, Andrew, does the federal government do that? Whether it be the carbon tax or whatever, it seems to be that the people that they could count on to help them with some things are evaporating.
Very true. I think on the carbon tax in particular, they had a whole scheme there where the provinces were kind of going to do the dirty work for them. Yeah. They would implement the tax. They would get to keep the revenues, but they would take the sort of more of the political heat, perhaps. They may need to rethink that. I mean, obviously, there's some provinces like Quebec and BC that already have their own things in place, but for the rest of them, it may. I'm not saying they're going to do this, but there may be something to be said for going back to the drawing board of a single national federal carbon tax that the feds would administer, where they could do it to their own designs. They could do a single price. They could make it simple, as opposed to this hodgepodge of different schemes all across the country. But they're clearly not going to be able to count upon the same kind of like-minded or pretended like-minded people that they had in the first flush of enthusiasm for Justin Trudeau right after he was elected.
And what is the consequence of that, Paul, do you think?
The tide has turned really quite markedly against the federal government on this file. And the feds are remarkably in denial about this. The Prime Minister is going to have the premiers to town later this autumn. His plan is not to talk about his carbon price scheme. He wants to talk about internal trade. I went looking for major speeches that the Environment Minister, Catherine McKenna, has given on this file in the last year and a half. She hasn't given any. Op-eds that she might have written for one paper or the other. She hasn't written any. The first step for the government has got to be, surely it's got to be to explain their thinking at a length longer than a tweet.
Chantal.
I'm not sure that the way out of this is for the federal government to tell the two provinces, the two large provinces that are cooperating, Quebec and BC, forget about your system, we're going to do our own tax. That would, I suspect, create unanimity against the federal government as opposed to having two large provinces on side.
Right.
The federal Liberals believe they can win this argument, that the governments that they are facing are speaking, and for sure Premier Ford was elected by a minority of voters, as are most governments in this country, and that they can win this argument in a federal election in part because they're going to try to appeal also to NDP voters.
Right.
I'm not sure that's going to work. It's going to be interesting if they do go in an election on a tax, but I'm not sure that they can't win it either. Just because a government that is conservative says, I don't want to do this, doesn't mean that the federal government cannot try to win a mandate off the people in an election.
And I think the political costs of not going ahead with this would be enormous.
Yeah.
So yes,
I
I think
believe
better
that
to go.
too.
Yeah, it's not electoral. It's not electoral reform that they can just say goodbye and move on. Okay, I somehow I'm going to do this in 2 minutes. NAFTA 2.0, because I don't know how to say the other thing yet. It's shocking to me that we don't really seem to be talking about it so much now on a Thursday after spending 2 days talking about it. So I'm not sure what that says about it. Maybe it says that it all came out in the wash. I don't know. Paul, you start us off on that.
I think it's a good deal. I honestly wonder whether if they had their druthers, the Trudeau government would prefer the old NAFTA or the new USMACA, as I like to call it. It holds the line on free trade. One of the least discussed elements of it is the U.S. tariff schedule, which is 281 pages, thousands of consumer goods, and the tariff attached to each of them is zero. We've been talking about the exceptions to the rule, but the rule is we still have a Continental Free Trade Pact. I think we're not talking about it because it's basically good news.
Andrew.
I wouldn't be quite as enthusiastic. I don't think it's a good deal. I think this is worse than the NAFTA that preceded it. But the damage was certainly limited. And I think when we looked at some of the scare stories, maybe they were only scare stories, but when we looked at some of the scenarios that were being played out, not just of canceling NAFTA or of 25% auto tariffs, but of getting rid of the dispute resolution mechanism, these kinds of things, the damage was relatively contained, and I think that's why you're not hearing so much about it.
Chantal.
I think Paul is right. We're not talking about it because it's a better deal than a lot of people expected. I spoke to someone who was close to the negotiations for it and who you'll understand why does not want to be named, who said, we would say it's a good deal, but Ottawa has told us to keep the lid on that because we're being watched by people south of the border and we don't want to say that we're happy with it.
That's smart. That's smart. As are all of you. Thank you for being here. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to At Issue, the podcast, for extra content. This week, we are going to talk about the future of energy projects in this country. 2 moves on that this week. Look for it on iTunes, any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.